Hi, everybody. This is Alan Petersen with Meet the Thriller Author. And for this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to be talking with John Gilstrap, who is the best-selling author of the Jonathan Grave thriller series and other books like Nathan's Run, which has been translated and published in one form or another in over 20 countries. A former firefighter, EMT, safety explosives, environmental engineer, and now an author. Very excited to talk to John. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So hope you're staying safe and healthy out there with the pandemic and all the craziness in the world.
Doing the best we can, right? It's invisible. So all you can do is hope.
Yep, so all we can do, really. So can you tell the listeners about your background, please?
I was an overnight success after a 38-year day. So I was 38 when my first book came out. Prior to that, I have a master's degree in safety engineering. My specialty in that is explosives and hazardous materials and hazardous waste. I also spent 15 years as a firefighter and EMT. So I didn't realize it at the time. I've always wanted to be a writer. It's kind of, that thing was always in the background of something I thought would be cool to do. I never thought I'd be a success at it. And looking back, it's kind of strange. I feel like I spent those years training to be a thriller writer.
And were you always like writing on the side, like things that never got published, never went anywhere, or?
Oh yeah, my first book, Nathan's Run, was officially my first book. It was actually my fourth book. So I wrote 3 of them for the drawer. But I never tried to do anything with them because I always knew in my heart of hearts, I've always been an avid reader. I'm an omnivore. And I just knew that those earlier books just weren't ready for prime time. So I never tried to do anything with them. And then when I finished with Nathan's Run, I thought, wow, I think this one will work.
And it worked pretty well, right? Right, your first book.
Yeah, my first book worked very well, actually. Yeah.
And so can you tell us about that, like your first publishing experience, and then with Nathan's Run coming out and being such a big bestseller?
Well, first of all, it was 1996, so it's been a long time. Everything was done by paper. So, you FedEx whole manuscripts back and forth, and everything's done by email. But back then, I had picked up 27 rejections from agents who didn't want to represent the book. Actually, I wrote a fairly crappy query letter is what happened. And I finally found an agent who would take me on. She called me on February 23rd, the things you remember, right? She called me on February 23rd, 1995, and said that she wanted to represent the book. And then she called me again on March 1st to say that she'd gotten several offers on the book. And then she called me on March 3rd to tell me that we had sold the movie rights and that the publishing rights had already been sold in 8 or 9 countries, whatever it was. And then it just went this juggernaut of contracts and success. And it was pretty cool. I mean, you wake up one morning and you're a safety engineer trying to make ends meet. And then suddenly, in a couple of days, it's like, wow, I've made more money than I've made cumulatively in my whole life up to that point. So it was quite a ride.
Yeah, that's fantastic too. Especially sometimes even when you get published, it still takes you a while to be able to make a living out of it. So that was
really
awesome.
And it was my first time. I didn't know that's not how it's supposed to work. It's certainly the dream. How did I know?
You're like, oh, I should have tried this earlier. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I'm always amazed. I always hear all the people that I've interviewed, usually with the rejections, is anywhere from like 20 to 100, but like 20 to 40 seems to be the sweet spot. So FYI to listeners out there who are aspiring to get published.
Well, for readers, for people who are out there looking to be published, remember this. A query letter, if your query letter is getting rejected, it's not your story, it's your letter, right? So these days, a good query letter should be able to get a request for even a bad manuscript because nobody will know it's a bad manuscript until after they've read it, right? So the issue now is that, with email, it's so easy to put stuff out now. The agents, everybody's just inundated with queries. So it's really hard to float to the top.
Yeah, and it is really crazy out there. I follow a few agents on Twitter, and some of the stories they tell about, pissed off authors who get rejected and they take it personally and start stalking them. It's just crazy out there.
There is a special level of cluelessness among artistic people. So, it's just the nature of the beast, I think. I'm glad that I got my start when I did. I think while a lot more stuff gets published these days, I think it's a lot harder to succeed these days than it did back then, simply because it was so difficult. When I was going through the query process again in the mid '90s, Stephen Hunter, who's now runaway best-selling author, the Bob Lee Swagger books, he was the film critic for the Baltimore Sun, and we had a mutual friend, so I called him up and I asked him how many times he had been rejected, and he said never. And well, okay, that's not helpful. And he said, well, no, but remember, his first manuscripts, he typed them. So, like roll the paper through the platen every time and start all over again. So each new draft was literally a page one rewrite. And he said, you really had to want it back then in order to keep going. So I think there's some truth to that. The barriers to entry feel much less now than they really are. But back then they were very real.
Yeah, I can't even imagine with a typewriter. So tell us a little bit about the Jonathan Graves series. That's I believe Hellfire is the latest book, and it's the 12th
Hellfire
novel.
is the latest book.
Yeah,
it's
number
12,
wow.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how did that get together?
Excuse me?
How did that series come together for you?
Back in 2006, I wrote a nonfiction book called 6 Minutes to Freedom. And at the time, I was told it was the only book that Delta Force, the first Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta, had ever cooperated in. And it told the story of the rescue of Kurt Muse, who was a political prisoner in Panama in 1989. And he was rescued in the opening moments of Operation Just Cause. So I got exposure to what these elite special forces groups really do. And it's pretty amazing that there's a difference between how kidnappings are handled domestically and how they're handled internationally. Domestically, if somebody is kidnapped, and I know some really good friends of mine are with the hostage rescue team, and they will tell you that a kidnapping is considered a homicide in slow motion. There's really very little anticipation for getting the good guy back. Not that they don't work hard for it. I'm not suggesting that they write anything off or anything of the sort. But the real goal of a hostage rescue run by the police department is to make sure that the bad guys don't go free. So you got to collect the evidence. You got to make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, the warrants are in good shape, and all that kind of stuff. Overseas, if you're taken prisoner overseas, the American intelligence forces start working on your rescue right away. And it happens more than you think. It happens a whole lot, actually. And more times than not, the rescue will be pulled off by local assets, whoever the Italian police or whatever the case may be. But there are a lot of places in the world where that doesn't happen. So in that case, the rescue is handled by these special forces groups. It's either going to be Delta Force or SEALs. And in that case, the mission is to rescue the hostage. Everything else is secondary. Excuse me, is secondary in rescuing the hostages. So if you can pick up intel, if you pick up bad guys or whatever the case may be, that's fine. But that's not the mission. So if you think about it, there's a very subtle but important difference there. So where Jonathan Graves, the seed, it's a very long answer to a short question, where the seed of the character came from was an independent operator who's a former Delta operator who takes the international model and applies it domestically, so that if your loved one is taken, he's going to get them back, and he doesn't really care much about what happens to the bad guys.
Yeah, it's always been fascinating with your series too, because as a child, I grew up in Venezuela in the '70s. My dad worked for a American corporation down there, and that was a real fear about getting kidnapped. And I remember there was a guy that got kidnapped, and he was gone for like 3 years. They did recover him actually after years. And then, of course, the whole thing with the Beirut in the '80s. I've always been fascinated with that field, and that people actually work in rescuing hostages. It's just pretty awesome.
I actually know a guy whose job he's not as flashy as Jonathan. In fact, it's almost an office job. But his job is to negotiate the ransoms for executives who are kidnapped and taken across the southern border to one place or another. And it happens so often. It's a business model. If you write the check or if you give the cash, you get your guy back. If you don't, then it gets difficult. But it's a real business model now. That's
wow.
as twisted and sick as it is, it kind of almost makes sense.
Kind of sad, but yeah, kind of crazy. So tell us about Hellfire. About the
Well, and Hellfire opens with Jonathan is, among other things, he's very wealthy. He's the son of a career criminal, and his dad is in prison and left him a lot of money that Jonathan is kind of ashamed of, actually. And one of the things that Jonathan did, trying to right wrongs, is he established a place called Resurrection House, which is a residential school for the children of incarcerated parents, which I actually think is kind of a cool idea. So in the opening moments of Hellfire, two brothers, Jeff and Ryder Kendall, are being transported from a foster home to Resurrection House when the vehicle they're in is stopped and attacked, and their chaperones are killed, and Jeff and Ryder are taken prisoner. So Jonathan, of course, is very close to this because they're coming to the place where that he sponsors. And what the story is really about is, in addition to the hostage rescue, the reason behind their kidnapping is kind of terrifying. It's by getting the kids back and getting ahead of the reason they were kidnapped will save thousands of lives. So that's kind of the backbone of Hellfire.
And so what's your process when you sit down to write these books? I mean, I'm assuming you do a lot of research up front. What's the process from getting the idea and sitting down to start to write these novels?
Obviously that question comes up a lot, and my truthful answer is I don't know, and I try not to think about it too much because I'm under contract and I got to produce a book. So what's the premise? Well, in this case, I thought kidnapping somebody on their way to Resurrection House, which we've established is very, very close to Jonathan's heart. Okay, that's really putting a stick in the hornet's nest. That will let off a good story. And then comes the endless whys. Well, why do they do that? Well, why would they do that? Well, okay, they've done this, but how does that pay off? So for me, I'm not a big outliner. I kind of find my way through and see what happens.
And what do you use? You use we know you don't use a typewriter. You use like Word or
just Word, just Microsoft Word. Yeah. And as I get ideas, as I type along. In fact, I stopped about 20 minutes ago. As I'm going along in a story, if I get an idea like, oh wow, this will be a cool scene, or whatever the case may be, I drop to the bottom of the manuscript and I just write myself a reminder. And then in the spot where it's going to go, I put 3 asterisks. So as I get to the end of a story, I do a lot of asterisk searching and a lot of note erasing. There'll be 30, 40, 50 pages of these notes at the end of a manuscript.
Oh, wow. And what's your, how many, once you finish writing, how long does it take you to polish it up before you send it off to your editors and everybody?
Well, I start every writing session by rewriting what I wrote the previous session, right? So it's as I go forward through a book, at any given point in time, it's fairly polished because I've already rewritten it at least once and sometimes 2 or 3 times. And then if I realize, oops, that scene, back in chapter 3 is not going to work, or I need to add a second floor to the building, or whatever the case may be, I go back and fix that real time. So really, by the time I get to the end of a book, my manuscript that I'm working on now is due on September 15th. I'll probably be done with the first go through around September 8th or 9th, and then do another quick read through and send it off. It's pretty clean at that point.
Is your work in progress now? Is it another Jonathan Grave novel?
It is.
Oh,
yeah,
awesome.
I've started another series called Crimson Phoenix, and I submitted that back in, I think it was April 1st, April 15th. And now I'm working on the new Grave books. I'm actually doing 2 series a year now.
Oh, okay.
Because I'm freaking crazy. But hey, COVID, I got nothing else to do.
So, yeah, there you go. It's perfect for writing. Perfect social distancing, right? 2 series.
Exactly. I get very close to my imaginary friends, but I think they're okay.
What's your other series? Has those books been published as well? I'm familiar with Jonathan Grave, but not the what do you say was the Phoenix? Sorry,
Crimson Phoenix.
Crimson Phoenix.
In this, it is such an entirely different. It could not be more different than the Grave books. They're still thrillers, But in this, the Crimson Phoenix series imagines World War III that lasts about 8 hours, and the everything is destroyed. All the infrastructure is gone, and um, weak people become feral pretty quickly in that circumstance. And it actually comes down to a single mom in West Virginia who turns out to be, her name is Victoria Emerson. She turns out to be the leader that she doesn't want to be, but everybody turns to. And it's kind of, I can't call it post-apocalyptic. That's my first thought, because nowadays that means zombies and supernatural stuff and all. It's none of that. It's really about people learning to do without stuff and rebuilding. There's been a lot of stuff over the years about preparing for the disasters and all this, but really what preppers. Now, there's a special line of research. If you want to go down a rabbit hole that can get kind of scary pretty quickly, start looking into the preppers. And but for the most part, preppers are all about preserving what's mine. It's you protect your family, you protect yourself. There's very little about rebuilding society after the fact. So I think this is, I'm a child of the 70s, so I've in 60s. I was influenced by Alas Babylon and On the Beach and all those 60s and 70s era after the war books. And this is just kind of one of those things that it hit me all of a sudden. And I love it. I'm really happy with the way the first one turned out. It'll be out in March.
Sounds fun. Yeah, that's really true, because you always hear especially back in the 50s and 60s and during the Cold War, was you go down to your bunker, your basement or whatever, but what would happen afterwards when everyone starts reemerging from those things?
Yeah. Well, Twilight Zone back in the day did several really good episodes on that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. What's the one with Bridges Meredith where he finally has time to read?
Library?
Yeah.
Man.
Oh, that was cruel. Won't spoil it in case people haven't seen it, but that's one of my favorite Twilight Zones. I noticed when I was on your website that you do a lot of speaking at literary events. Well, when we were able to travel, maybe next year, right? So that's fascinating. So you actually help a lot in the new writers in the writing community. How did you start getting into that, and how does that work for you? Do you enjoy doing that?
I love doing it. I don't know how it started. I think it started by saying yes when you get invited to speak to a writers conference. And the conferences that I do, it's anywhere from, I can do it in 6 hours. I can do it in 2 hours, right? Obviously the 6 hours has a lot more writing exercises and all this. I teach the class that I wish someone had taught to me while I had to learn all this stuff on my own. The do's and don'ts. There are no rules to writing. Absolutely. The only rule is that there are no rules. But there's some really good suggestions, and there are ways to keep a story going forward. And I enjoy teaching that. In fact, if I can hype my YouTube channel.
Yeah, I was going to mention that one because I was checking some of your videos out.
It's called A Writer's View of Writing and Publishing, or author John Gilstrap will get you there on YouTube. I got, 25, 30 videos out now. And in those, it's kind of again, it's an insider's view. It takes a small slice of this industry and talks about, like, how do writers get paid? How do movie deals happen? What happens when there's a movie deal? Do you really need an agent? Those kinds of things. They run anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I liked of them too. They you cover a lot of information, but they're concise, because there's some videos out there that are like 2 hours long. So yeah, I like yours. You pack a lot of information on them. So highly recommend. And you focus on suspense writing. So some of the videos are on that. So for listeners of this podcast, I know we have some aspiring writers. It's highly recommend them to check that out. So I'm kind of curious. So once you're in the writing mode, do you write every day, or do you take a break between projects, or?
Well, I'm a September 15th deadline, so I write every day now. I wish I had written every day 2 months ago.
You're paying for that now, right?
Exactly. It's I'm a professional at what I do, right? And professional means not just that you get paid, but it also means that you have a professional attitude. So I go to work every day. And some days are more productive in terms of creating story than others. Some days are the YouTube channel. Some days are doing interviews. Some days are being an author is being a businessman. So you got the business side of things and the creative side. So, but basically, I try now. I'm kind of caught in a crack, so I got to do probably a couple thousand words a day to really make my deadlines. But generally, there are physical limits to this. You sit in a chair. For me, I'm kind of an ADD kind of guy anyway. For me to sit in a chair for more than 2 or 3 hours at a pop is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like one of those big writing days, it's hard to explain, but you like kind of feel like drained, like you're like dizzy. If you're like one of those crazy days when you're writing hours and hours, it's just like it really is, your neck hurts. It's just kind of crazy.
And your focal length is stuck at like 2 feet. You can't see anything beyond. You can't see anything closer.
Yeah. So have you found that has the pandemic changed anything in your writing process or the way things get done? I mean, I guess now where everything's done video and for everybody. So it's kind of curious on for you as a writer.
It was bizarre to be writing a post-apocalyptic story during the apocalypse. Things were cutting a little close to home. But now, I live in Virginia and things have, pretty much opened up. You got the mask thing and what have you, but restaurants are opened up again. You can eat inside again and you don't have to wear a mask while you're sitting at the table. Yeah. So things are kind of coming back to normal, but it felt very, for a few weeks there at the beginning, it felt a little emotionally, it felt kind of the same place as right after 9/11. It's like everything has changed so much so quickly. Adapting to it was a little bit scary, but we had plenty of toilet paper to start with. So, we at least didn't have to suffer that.
Yeah, I happened to had stocked up just before. Normally, I mean, I didn't go elbow people. I had no idea. I didn't realize it was going to become such a thing. I'm like, oh my God, I bought some because all of a sudden it was like people were like,
well, we buy those products at Costco, so you can't buy a roll.
Yeah.
Right there, you got a month's supply at least.
Yeah. That's why I bought. I had gone to Target. I bought the big thing, which is what I always buy. But it was like right a week before everything happened. I was watching this on TV, and my wife like, "Wow, well, I'm glad I bought that last week because for a while there, it was looking kind of crazy there." But yeah, it was interesting times, that's for sure. I'm kind of curious now. Were you a fan of thrillers and suspense books before you started to write them as a reader?
I think that's all I've ever read, except what I was forced to read in English class. I did my stint with the Hardy Boys and Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators and those kind of mystery things for boys. But then Alistair MacLean and Frederick Forsyth and, it's just all of those Trevanian, I think, was a writer back in the 60s or 70s. Back then I would read the books that my parents put on the shelves. I couldn't afford to buy books. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, I've always been a sucker for meaningful action. And what I mean is I want to care about the characters. I don't want just, action scene. That's I have never, until Daniel Craig took over as James Bond in the films, I don't think I ever stayed awake through a James Bond movie. It just, it pushes credibility to the limit, and it's just one thing after another, and you know how it's going to end, right? So I want to have character development and something meaningful in the stories. I tell you what, the first book that taught me how to write a thriller. I wasn't really looking for it, but it just sort of, the first time I saw the skeleton of the structure was Frederick Forsyth's Day of the Jackal.
I love that book, yeah.
I love that book. I don't know how many times I've read it. I first read it as, we were a very literary family, so we had Reader's Digest condensed books. And I read it first there, and then I went out and got the book in the library and read the real version of it. And that's where I saw how Frederick Forsyth took interesting characters. Obviously, the premise is very interesting too, but how he would use changing scenes and space breaks and how chapters would end in the way that you could not go on. And so I saw that there's a certain amount of manipulation. There's no criticism in that at all, because I do it too. There's a certain amount of manipulation in creating thrillers. And that's where I saw it. And I thought at the time, early high school, I thought, I can do this. And then 20 years later.
Yeah, I remember thinking that too when I read those classic books. I'm like, oh wow! Then you get all excited and you start, and then like a week later, you're like, oh man, you just walk away mumbling.
This is hard.
Yeah, yeah. Those are great books in the '70s too. Marathon Man. I can't remember the Goldman. Was it
Yeah.
Marathon?
Yep.
Yeah, and I remember I watched those movies growing up as a kid, and then when I really got into reading, I went back and read the books, and they're like, oh, the books are even better. Some of them.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty awesome. So you said that even like that you've dipped your toes in the whole Hollywood world. Some of your books have been optioned. How's that whole process? It must be kind of crazy.
It is crazy. I don't want to disparage anybody because I'd love to do it again. Four of my books have been either sold or optioned to various studios, and I have worked on four. I've written four screenplays for Hollywood, and the writing process is the writing process. I don't find it to be that much different, quite honestly, but the business side of Hollywood is just bizarre. Handshakes don't mean as much in Hollywood as they do in New York. I think the biggest shift with dealing with Hollywood is there's no individual who makes a decision. Everything is done by committee. So when I create a book, it's me, and my editor obviously has a vote, a big one, but she can't change anything. That she needs my permission. The book belongs to me. In Hollywood, everything's work for hire. So you go through all this effort and you produce something and you hand it over, and people can change it however they want. The money's good, the money is fast, but it's entirely different. I think that the culture shock for somebody like me who primarily makes a living in New York publishing, the culture shock going to LA is really hard.
Yeah, I think that's why you see a lot of the screenwriters now are going into publishing novels. Like even Dick Wolf is writing books now, so it's kind of interesting. So it's just it must be nice to have a little bit more control over your work, but yeah, you still open that door if they come knocking.
Oh, absolutely, and and there's a capriciousness to Hollywood, whether it's as part of the Writers Guild and all that, and the guild goes on strike, and suddenly, you're out of work, and in the studios, as they got to make money. So I say the studios, but that means production companies. The studios in a larger sense, they move on to other things. That's where reality television came from. Was from the first big writer's strike. Hey, we don't need to pay screenwriters for episodic television. We can take cameras out into real life and just shoot that and pretend it's real. So, it's that whole I don't work and play well with others. I guess that's where we're coming from.
Yeah. That's social distancing again.
Exactly.
And do you still find time to read for pleasure?
I do, but most of my reading now is actually unpublished works that come to me from agents or editors who are looking for blurbs on the covers. And I find a lot of pleasure in that. Most of it is actually pretty good stuff. But in terms of finding the whatever is on the bestseller list and the new best thing, no, I typically don't have time for that. And part of it is because I spent all day reading and reading what I've written, reading other stuff and all of that. And the stuff on Netflix and Amazon Prime, some of that long form television stuff is terrific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love those. I love those shows, like Ozark, and they got a lot of great shows out there now on those on Netflix and Amazon Prime. It's just incredible. I always wonder about the blurbing stuff. So that's how that works. The actual publisher send them the books to you and say, hey, take a look if you don't mind. And that's how that all works.
Yeah, in essence, either it comes blind, which doesn't happen quite as often as you get mail at the time that this is a new author. We love what he's doing and really could use a leg up. It's sort of the letters are written in such a way it's very difficult to say no to them. And and people are receiving those letters. Crimson Phoenix is coming out, so my editor sent out a bunch of blurb requests on that to various authors just last week. So it's kind of the way the industry works. But I will tell you this. I mean, just we do one must have principles. I will never blurb anything I don't like.
Mm-hmm.
So I won't be pressured into that. And there are some, I won't go into the details, but there was one that was just such a politically hot topic that I just said, no. You know, no, I don't need that in my life. I don't need my name on that thing. So no.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I want to go into that area of nowadays. Yeah, be in the crosshairs right now. Yeah. So what's next for you and for Jonathan Grave?
Well, right now I'm in the middle of a book called Stealth Attack, which will come out next July, due in September. And I'm still feeling my way through it, quite honestly. One of Jonathan's technical genius is a young lady named Venice Alexander. And it's her son is on a field trip down in Texas, along with his girlfriend that mom didn't know about. And they are both taken, and they're taken across the border. And now it falls to Jonathan to get them back. But again, as always the case with the books, it's the rationale behind the kidnapping is where the real drama is, in addition to it's fairly dramatic to be held hostage.
Yeah, can only imagine. Yeah, I can only imagine what you've seen in your research too. Keep you up at night. And so the best place for listeners to find you is at your website, johngilstrap.com.
That's the best place to start. Everything else follows from there.
Yeah, and I really love the way your website is laid out too. So I highly recommend readers and you can check out your YouTube channel and all that stuff.
Yeah, and in fact, there's an essays section there that again for aspiring writers who are out there. It's got the query letter that sold my first book again 25 years ago, and it also has the full synopsis for Nathan's Run. Synopses, I think, are true mysteries to people. It's so hard. It takes you 100,000 words to write the book, and then you've got 1,000 words just to make it dramatic and tell people what it's about. So, that kind of stuff is on there too.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I'll have to check that out myself. Because, yeah, that's the whole thing. Even though a lot of things change in publishing, like that part is still the same as it's always been. You have to try to get an agent and then have them to go sell the manuscript for you. And I'll start with a query letter.
And it's still a relationship business. It's about being good at what you do, but it's also about being friendly and have a work ethic and be true to your word and all that stuff that you learn in other business that you've had. But it really is, it's interpersonal. I know people who've never met their agents or editors, yet you're still in close contact, and that personal dynamic makes a big difference.
All right. Well, Hellfire was published June 30th, so listeners go check it out. It's a fun series, and excited that it's continuing. So that'll something to look forward to. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.